Tonight, you step into a city that should not exist. The air smells faintly of stone dust and olive oil lamps. Narrow streets stretch ahead of you, lined with tall apartment blocks and small shops that are just beginning to close for the evening. Somewhere nearby, a fountain trickles softly. The sound of water echoes between the walls like a quiet lullaby. And that's strange, because you are standing in a city built more than 2,000 years ago. A Roman city. Yet everything around you feels oddly advanced. The streets are paved. Public baths are steaming. Fountains are running with fresh water. And somehow, despite the massive population, there is almost no filth piling up in the streets. Which is confusing, because if you jump forward 1,000 years into medieval Europe, millions of people are getting sick from dirty water, sewage, and terrible sanitation. So how did an ancient civilization solve a problem that medieval societies completely failed at? And more importantly, why did the solution disappear? Tonight, you are going to wander through Roman streets, follow the hidden tunnels beneath them, and discover a world of engineering so clever that parts of it still influence modern cities today. But fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive long here. Not because the Romans were primitive, but because their cities were too efficient, too crowded, and sometimes a little too comfortable, with things that would make a modern person panic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me something in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what's the local time there right now? Some of you are probably listening late at night. Others might be starting your morning. Either way, you're about to travel back nearly 2,000 years. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the city. It's evening now, and the streets are slowly filling with people finishing their daily routines. A baker is closing his shop after a long day of selling bread. A group of merchants argue loudly about prices near the forum. Somewhere down the street, a public bathhouse is still buzzing with conversation and steam. And beneath your feet, hidden under the stone roads, is something remarkable. Water. Lots of it. Fresh, clean water is flowing constantly through the city. Historians estimate that some Roman cities provided hundreds of liters of water per person every single day. That is comparable to what many modern cities deliver today. The water arrives through massive stone aqueducts stretching across valleys and hills for dozens of miles. From a distance, these aqueducts look like elegant bridges marching across the countryside. But they are not bridges. They are water highways. The engineering is almost absurdly precise. Many aqueducts slope downward only a few centimeters per 100 meters, allowing gravity to move the water slowly but steadily toward the city. No pumps, no electricity, just careful mathematics and stone. And once the water reaches the city, it spreads everywhere. Public fountains gush continuously. Bathhouses receive fresh supplies all day long. Wealthier homes even have private water pipes feeding their kitchens and gardens. It feels modern. But the real secret is not the water coming in. It's the water going out. Because Roman cities were obsessed with drainage. Underneath many Roman streets run complex sewer systems designed to carry waste away from crowded neighborhoods. Some of these tunnels are large enough for a person to walk through. One of the most famous examples is the Cloaca Maxima, one of the earliest sewer systems ever built. Parts of it were constructed more than 2,500 years ago, and incredibly, sections of it still function today. Imagine that. A sewer older than most countries still doing its job. But here's the strange part. Roman sanitation was not actually designed primarily for hygiene. Scholars still argue whether the Romans truly understood the link between dirty water and disease. Germ theory wouldn't exist for nearly 2,000 more years. Instead, Roman sanitation was mostly about convenience and comfort. Running water made cities smell better. Bathhouses made social life enjoyable. Fountains made public spaces beautiful. Cleanliness was almost a side effect. And yet, the system worked astonishingly well. Now picture yourself walking through a Roman neighborhood at night. Torches flicker on the walls. Water trickles constantly through fountains and drains. Somewhere underground, the sewers quietly carry waste away toward the river. Compared to many medieval cities that would come later, this place feels almost futuristic, which makes the next part of the story even more mysterious. Because somehow, all of this knowledge will disappear. Aqueducts will collapse. Sewer tunnels will clog. Public baths will close. And across Europe, cities will slowly begin to smell much, much worse. But for now, you're still standing in the Roman world. And if you follow the sound of running water, you'll soon discover the real heart of the system. The enormous aqueducts that feed the entire city. Because once you see how they work, you'll realize something slightly terrifying. The entire civilization depends on them. One broken aqueduct could leave 1 million people thirsty. And that is exactly the kind of vulnerability history loves to exploit. So you begin walking toward the edge of the city, where the great arches rise above the hills, carrying rivers through the sky. You walk toward the edge of the city, and slowly the houses begin to thin out. The noise of merchants fades. The smell of cooking bread disappears behind you. Instead, the land opens into rolling hills dotted with olive trees and dusty paths. And then you see it. Rising across the valley like a stone giant is an aqueduct. Row after row of arches stretch across the landscape, perfectly aligned, carrying a narrow channel of water high above the ground. From far away, it almost looks decorative, like a monument built purely for beauty. But every second, water is flowing through it. Thousands of liters. Quietly, constantly, day and night. You walk closer, and the scale becomes clearer. Each arch is tall enough for several people to stand on each other's shoulders. The stone blocks fit together so tightly that many of them have stood here for nearly 2,000 years. Roman engineers had an almost obsessive relationship with precision. Most aqueducts were built with a slope so slight that you would barely notice it. In many cases, the water drops only about 1 meter for every kilometer traveled. Too steep, and the water would rush too fast and damage the structure. Too flat, and it would stop flowing altogether. So Roman surveyors spent months measuring hills, valleys, and rock formations before construction even began. One of the tools they used was called the chorobates, a long, wooden frame with water channels that helped engineers detect tiny differences in elevation. It sounds simple, but the accuracy they achieved, without modern instruments, is honestly a little shocking. In fact, some aqueducts stretched more than 80 kilometers before reaching their destination. A famous example is the Pont du Gard, a massive 3-level aqueduct bridge that still stands today. When you look at it, the structure feels almost impossibly elegant, like architecture and engineering decided to cooperate for once. And yet, the water flowing through Roman aqueducts wasn't always as perfectly clean as you might imagine. Here's the slightly uncomfortable detail. Many Roman pipes were made from lead. Yes, the same metal modern societies avoid because it can cause serious health problems. For a long time, historians debated whether lead poisoning slowly weakened Roman society. Scholars still argue whether the amount of lead in Roman drinking water was actually dangerous or if mineral deposits inside the pipes prevented most contamination. It's one of those strange historical debates where the truth sits somewhere in the middle. Either way, the system worked well, enough that Roman cities had far more water than they strictly needed. And Romans absolutely loved using it. Public fountains ran non-stop. Bathhouses consumed enormous quantities every day. Some cities even installed decorative water features simply because they could. Imagine walking through a Roman plaza late at night. Water splashes into marble basins. Lamps reflect off the surface. The constant sound of flowing water echoes through the streets like gentle rain. To a traveler from the ancient world, this must have felt incredibly luxurious. because most ancient cities had a completely different reality. In many places, people relied on wells, rivers, or rainwater storage. Water had to be carried in buckets. Supplies were limited. And during dry seasons, things could become unpleasant very quickly. Rome solved that problem by simply building more aqueducts. By the height of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome itself had 11 separate aqueduct systems feeding water into the capital. One of the most impressive was the Aqua Claudia, completed during the reign of Emperor Claudius. Its massive arches carried water across the countryside for more than 60 kilometers before reaching the city. When the water finally arrived, it didn't just pour randomly into the streets. It entered distribution tanks called castella. These tanks worked like ancient water control centers. Engineers could redirect water into different pipes that fed bathhouses, fountains, private homes, and industrial workshops. Even ancient laundries relied on this system. Roman fullers, professional cloth cleaners, used flowing water to rinse clothes after washing them in mixtures that sometimes included fermented urine. Yes, that was a real cleaning ingredient. Roman laundry probably smelled complicated, but the constant flow of water helped rinse everything away, keeping the city surprisingly clean for such a densely populated place. Still, the system had one critical weakness. It depended entirely on maintenance. Aqueduct channels could clog with mineral deposits. Earthquakes could crack tunnels. Tree roots could slowly push apart stone blocks. And because many aqueducts stretched for dozens of kilometers across open countryside, they were also vulnerable to sabotage during wars. A single damaged section could cut off water to thousands of people. Roman authorities knew this, which is why aqueduct maintenance was taken extremely seriously. There were entire teams of workers, called aquarii, whose job was to inspect, repair, and clean the water channels. They climbed inside narrow tunnels, removed sediment buildup, patched cracks, and cleared blockages. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept the entire system alive. And as long as the aqueducts flowed, Roman cities thrived. Fountains sparkled. Bathhouses steamed. Sewers flushed waste away beneath the streets. For centuries, the system functioned almost like a perfectly tuned machine. But outside the empire, the world was slowly changing. Tribes were moving. Borders were weakening. And one day, when the Roman government could no longer protect or maintain these vast networks of stone and water, the aqueducts would fall silent. And when they did, the consequences would reshape European cities for nearly 1,000 years. But for now, the water is still flowing. You follow the sound of voices drifting through the evening air. Soft laughter, the splash of water, the low murmur of dozens of conversations blending together like background music. Ahead of you rises one of the most beloved buildings in any Roman city, the bathhouse. Even from outside, it looks enormous, more like a palace than a place to wash. Tall columns frame the entrance, and warm light spills from inside, glowing against the night sky. And if you're imagining a small room with a few tubs of water, you're about to be very wrong. Roman bathhouses were massive social centers. In fact, a mainstream historical fact is that some of the largest baths in Rome could hold thousands of visitors at once. The famous baths of Caracalla, for example, were big enough to fit entire crowds moving through different chambers of heat, steam, and cold water. You step inside. The air immediately changes. Warmth wraps around you like a blanket, and the scent of olive oil, steam, and faint perfume fills the room. Marble floors reflect torchlight, and everywhere you look, people are moving through the complex with practiced routine. Some are talking, some are resting, some are just floating quietly in the pools. Bathing in Rome isn't just about hygiene, it's practically a daily ritual. Most visitors begin in a room called the appetiterium, where they remove their clothes and store them in small wall niches. Slaves or attendants sometimes watch the belongings, though petty theft wasn't exactly unheard of. From there, people move through a sequence of rooms designed to gently guide the body through different temperatures. First comes the tepidarium. This room is warm but not hot. Think of it as a gentle transition, allowing the body to adjust. The air is pleasant, and many visitors pause here just to sit and chat. Next is the caldarium, the hottest room in the complex. As you step inside, a wave of heat hits you immediately. Steam rises from a large hot pool in the center, and the walls themselves feel warm to the touch. The reason for that warmth lies beneath your feet. Roman engineers created an ingenious heating system called the hypocaust. Essentially, the floors of the bathhouse were raised on small pillars, creating empty spaces underneath. Workers maintained furnaces that pumped hot air through these spaces, heating the floors and walls from below. It's basically an ancient version of underfloor heating. Scholars still argue whether the hypocaust system was originally invented by the Romans themselves or improved from earlier Greek designs, but either way, the Romans perfected it. After sweating in the caldarium, bathers often plunge into the frigidarium, a room filled with cold water. The sudden temperature shock was believed to invigorate the body. And honestly, after sitting in steam for long enough, that cold pool probably felt amazing. But here's the quirky detail that often surprises people. Eventually, you step back out of the bathhouse and into the quiet Roman street. The air feels cooler now. A soft breeze moves between the stone buildings, and somewhere nearby a fountain continues its endless trickle. For a moment, the city seems peaceful, almost too clean for a place where hundreds of thousands of people live. But if you look down at the street beneath your feet, you might notice something curious. Small openings between the stones, dark channels disappearing under the road, and occasionally, a faint rushing sound from somewhere below. Because while water flows into Rome through aqueducts, another equally important system is quietly carrying things out. Beneath this city lies a network of sewers, and not small ones, either. Some of them are large enough for a person to walk through. One of the most famous is the Cloaca Maxima, a massive drainage tunnel originally built over 2,500 years ago. Early Roman kings began constructing it to drain swampy land in the valley, where the Roman Forum would eventually rise. Over time, the tunnel was expanded, reinforced with stone, and connected to many smaller drainage channels. By the height of the Roman Empire, it had become one of the most impressive sanitation systems in the ancient world. And it still exists today. Imagine that for a second. A sewer built before the birth of the Roman Empire is still standing, beneath modern streets. That's the level of durability Roman engineers aimed for. Of course, the purpose of these sewers wasn't exactly glamorous. They carried away wastewater from fountains, bathhouses, rainstorms, and, yes, human waste. Public latrines were common throughout Roman cities. These were long stone benches with evenly spaced holes carved into them. Beneath the benches, water flowed constantly through shallow channels, carrying waste away into the sewer system. If you're picturing a private bathroom stall, you might want to adjust that mental image. Roman latrines were communal. People sat side by side, sometimes chatting casually while taking care of business. It was a strangely social experience. And the cleaning tool was equally unusual. Instead of toilet paper, Romans used a sponge attached to a stick, known as a tessorium. After use, the sponge would be rinsed in running water or vinegar and placed back for the next person. Not exactly the most comforting hygiene system by modern standards, but compared to what came later in medieval Europe, it was surprisingly effective. The constant flow of water in Roman sanitation systems helped prevent waste from piling up in the streets. Rainwater drains also fed into the sewers, flushing debris away during storms. In other words, the city was constantly cleaning itself. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Scholars still argue whether Roman sewers were designed mainly for sanitation or simply for drainage. Some historians believe their primary goal was to prevent flooding, rather than improve hygiene. But either way, the result was the same. Waste moved away from crowded streets instead of staying there, which made a huge difference for public health. You might even notice another clever detail as you walk along the road. Large stepping stones placed across certain streets. At first, they looked decorative, but they actually served two practical purposes. First, they allowed pedestrians to cross muddy roads without stepping directly into the street. Second, the gaps between the stones were spaced perfectly, so that wagon wheels could roll through without hitting them. So while carts passed through the street below, people could step from stone to stone above the mess. Roman urban planning had a habit of solving multiple problems at once. And because water flowed constantly through fountains, baths, and sewers, the city maintained a surprisingly steady cycle of cleanliness. Fresh water arrives. Used water drains away. Rain washes the streets. The system keeps moving. But maintaining such a delicate balance required something incredibly important: a powerful central government, engineers, maintenance crews, funding, organization. If any of those pieces disappeared, the entire system could start to crumble. And unfortunately for Rome, that's exactly what eventually happened. As the centuries passed, the Roman Empire faced growing pressures, economic troubles, political instability, external invasions, and slowly, almost quietly at first, the massive infrastructure that supported Roman cities began to weaken. Aqueducts were damaged during wars. Maintenance crews disappeared. Funding dried up. And once those water systems stopped working, cities that once sparkled with fountains and bathhouses began to change. Because without clean water flowing in, and without waste flowing out, urban life becomes a very different experience. You'll see exactly what that difference looks like soon. Because in a few centuries, you'll find yourself walking through another European city. But this one will smell very different. The streets will be crowded. The water will be questionable. And the sanitation systems that once made Roman cities so advanced will mostly be forgotten. Welcome, eventually, to medieval Europe. You continue walking through the Roman streets. And the more time you spend here, the more one quiet truth becomes obvious. Water shapes daily life. Not in dramatic ways, not in crashing waves or roaring rivers, but in small, constant routines that repeat across the entire city. A man rinsing vegetables at a public fountain. A baker washing flour from his hands. Children splashing water across warm stone after a long afternoon of play. You start to notice how naturally Romans expect clean water to be available. Because for them, it usually is. One of the most fascinating facts about Roman cities is that many neighborhoods had public fountains, placed within a short walking distance of homes. These fountains weren't decorative luxuries. They were practical infrastructure. Fresh water from the aqueducts flowed into large storage tanks called castella. From there, smaller pipes distributed water throughout the city. Some pipes fed bathhouses. Others supplied wealthy homes. But a large portion went directly to public fountains so that ordinary citizens could collect water easily. You watch as a woman approaches one of these fountains carrying 2 clay jars balanced carefully in her arms. She sets them down, waits patiently while the basin fills, then lifts them again with the smooth confidence of someone who has done this every day for years. For most Romans, this is the center of daily life. Water collection happens in the morning. Cooking follows. Cleaning comes later. Bathing happens in the evening. And all of it depends on a system quietly working beyond the city walls. Scholars estimate that ancient Rome may have had access to hundreds of millions of liters of water every single day once all 11 aqueducts were functioning. That amount was extraordinary for the ancient world. Even some modern cities would struggle to match it without advanced technology. And the Romans didn't just use this water for drinking or bathing. They used it everywhere. Take Roman laundries, for example. These were called phalanaki, and they were surprisingly busy places. Workers cleaned clothing using large stone basins, filled with water and special cleaning mixtures. Here's the slightly bizarre detail. One common ingredient used in Roman laundry was fermented urine. Yes, urine. It contains ammonia, which helps break down oils and stains in fabric. Large public jars were even placed around cities so people could donate, well, raw materials. Once collected, the liquid was used to soak clothes before they were rinsed with fresh flowing water. It sounds unpleasant, but chemically speaking, it actually worked quite well. Roman laundries relied heavily on steady water, supplies to rinse garments thoroughly after washing. Without aqueduct-fed fountains and channels, these businesses wouldn't have been possible. Water also powered certain types of Roman industry. Mills sometimes used flowing streams redirected through channels to grind grain into flour. Gardens and farms outside. The city relied on irrigation systems that diverted water from nearby sources, even decorative gardens inside. Wealthy villas used small fountains and artificial streams to create peaceful landscapes. In a way, Roman cities functioned almost like living organisms. Water enters. Water circulates. Water leaves. Everything flows through the system. But there's another interesting detail hidden in Roman plumbing. Since aqueducts relied on gravity rather than pumps, engineers had to carefully control how water descended into the city. You leave the busy streets behind and follow the invisible path of water back toward the countryside. Because every drop flowing through Roman fountains begins its journey somewhere far away from a city, somewhere quiet, somewhere high. Eventually the land rises into gentle hills, and the air grows cooler. The dusty roads fade into narrow trails winding between rocks and wild grass. In the distance, you hear the faint sound of running water, not from a fountain, but from nature itself. This is where Roman engineers began their work. Most aqueducts started at natural springs hidden in hills or mountains. These springs were carefully chosen because they produced steady, clean water year-round. Roman surveyors would spend weeks studying the land before deciding where to build. They looked for sources that were not only clean but also higher than the city, allowing gravity to carry the water downhill without pumps. Gravity, after all, never needs maintenance. Once a suitable spring was found, engineers constructed a collection basin to gather the water. From there, the aqueduct channel began its long journey toward the city. And that journey could be incredibly complicated. Contrary to what many people imagine, most aqueducts did not travel across giant bridges the entire way. Those dramatic arches were actually used only when the channel had to cross a valley or uneven terrain. For much of the route, aqueducts were hidden underground. Workers carved tunnels through hillsides, lined them with waterproof cement, and covered them with stone slabs. This protected the water from contamination and kept it cool as it flowed toward the city. Roman engineers even invented a special waterproof concrete called opus signinum, made by mixing lime with crushed pottery. The result created a smooth, durable lining that prevented leaks inside aqueduct channels. It's one of the quiet technological secrets behind the Roman water system. And here's a quirky detail that often surprises people. Roman aqueduct water wasn't always crystal clear when it first entered the system. Springs sometimes carried small particles of sand, minerals, or organic material. So engineers added settling tanks along the route. These tanks slowed the water slightly, allowing heavier particles to sink to the bottom before the water continued downstream. Workers periodically cleaned the tanks, removing the accumulated sediment. It was essentially a basic form of water filtration, long before modern purification plants existed. Scholars still argue Whether Roman engineers fully understood the chemistry behind water purification or if they simply relied on practical observation. Either way, they clearly knew that cleaner water made cities healthier. And when the aqueduct finally approached the city walls, it entered another fascinating stage of its journey. Instead of rushing directly into homes or fountains, the water first flowed into large distribution reservoirs. These reservoirs acted like ancient water control hubs. Inside them, the water was divided into different channels. Some pipes carried water to public fountains. Others fed bathhouses. A smaller portion was sometimes reserved for private houses, belonging to wealthy citizens. The Roman government even regulated these connections. Illegal tapping of aqueduct pipes was considered a serious offense. Special officials called curators, aquarum, oversaw the entire system and ensured water was distributed fairly. At least, in theory. In reality, wealth and political influence often found ways to bend the rules. But even with occasional corruption, the Roman water network remained remarkably effective. Water arrived. Water circulated. Water left. For centuries, the system kept functioning almost like a giant machine running quietly across the landscape. And if you stand near the source of one of these aqueducts at night, the scene is surprisingly peaceful. The spring bubbles gently from the rock. The channel carries water forward with a soft, constant whisper. Moonlight reflects faintly on the surface. It feels almost impossible that something so calm could sustain a massive city dozens of kilometers away. Yet every drop moving through this channel will eventually end up in someone's cup, someone's bath, or someone's fountain. The entire civilization depends on it. And that's precisely what makes the system so fragile. Because once the Roman Empire begins to weaken, maintaining these long aqueduct routes becomes incredibly difficult. Tunnels collapse. Bridges crack. Enemies target the structures during wars. Without maintenance crews traveling the countryside to repair damage, even small problems begin to grow. At first, the water pressure drops slightly. Then certain fountains stop working. Eventually, entire sections of aqueduct fall into ruin. And when that happens, Roman cities lose the one advantage that made them cleaner and healthier than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. Clean, flowing water. Soon, you'll move forward in time, centuries ahead. The Roman engineers will be gone. The aqueducts will stand broken across the countryside. And the cities of medieval Europe will struggle with a problem the Romans solved long ago. Where does the water come from? And where does the waste go? You return to the city once more, but this time your attention drifts downward. Not toward fountains, not toward baths, but toward the ground beneath your feet. Because beneath the calm streets of Rome, an entire hidden world is quietly doing its job. Water doesn't simply appear in a city and then disappear magically. Every drop used in fountains, baths, kitchens, and laundries eventually has to go somewhere. And in Rome, that somewhere is an underground maze of tunnels. Now imagine the world several centuries later. You move forward through time, past the fall of emperors, past the slow collapse of Roman authority, past the quiet abandonment of aqueducts stretching across the countryside. When you arrive again in a European city, something immediately feels different. The streets are narrower. The buildings lean closer together, their upper floors almost touching above the road. Wooden beams jut out from plaster walls, and the ground beneath your feet is no longer smooth Roman stone. It's mud. Thick, sticky mud. Because this city no longer has the flowing water systems that once kept Roman streets clean. Instead of fountains bubbling at every corner, most residents now rely on wells. A well sits in the center of the town square, surrounded by buckets and ropes. Every morning, people gather here to draw water for cooking, drinking, and washing. The problem is simple. Wells don't move water. They only store it. And when a city grows crowded, the water in those wells can quickly become contaminated. Nearby waste seeps into the ground. Animal manure mixes with rainwater. Garbage piles slowly decompose. Eventually, some of that pollution reaches the same groundwater people are drinking. Scholars still argue whether medieval communities fully understood the connection between dirty water and disease. Germ theory wouldn't exist for many centuries. So most people blamed illness on bad air or mysterious imbalances in the body. Still, many towns did try to manage waste in their own ways. But those methods often relied on something far less organized than Roman sewers: human habits. For example, in many medieval towns, residents emptied chamber pots directly into the street. Yes, the street. At night, someone might lean out a window and toss waste downward, sometimes shouting a warning like Gardeloo to alert anyone walking below. If you're strolling through a medieval street at the wrong moment, well, let's just say timing becomes extremely important. Unlike Roman roads designed with drainage channels, many medieval streets had uneven surfaces where waste could collect in stagnant pools. Rain helped wash some of it away, but during dry weather the filth simply remained. Animals made the problem worse. Chickens wandered freely. Pigs rooted through trash. Horses pulled carts through narrow lanes. All of them left behind waste that mixed into the growing layers of mud. It wasn't unusual for medieval city streets to develop a permanent, unpleasant smell. Travelers from other regions often wrote about it in their descriptions. Yet medieval people weren't necessarily careless or ignorant. They simply lacked the enormous infrastructure that Roman engineers once maintained. Building aqueducts and sewer networks required strong central governments, skilled engineers, and large amounts of money. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, those resources became scattered. Cities shrank. Trade declined. Technical knowledge